How's it going, people? 2 days ago, on the 18th of November, the UK government announced that all sales of new petrol and diesel cars would be banned from the year 2030. This has sparked a bunch of conversation, but not just within the car community, and I thought I'd go over it in this video. What will happen to the long-term prices of petrol and diesel used cars? How long will we continue to be able to drive used petrol and diesel cars? What will happen to the prices of fuel? How will manufacturers manage the transition? And ultimately, how will this affect my bank balance? Well, in this video, I'll give you a brief overview of what has been announced. I'll let you know all of my thoughts and opinions on what I reckon will be the answer to those questions. I'll give you some speculation from my end and basically tell you what I think this means for you and I, the consumers. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions though, so let me know in the comments down below everything about this, what your opinions are, whatever you know, what you think is going to happen to values of cars over the time, all of that stuff. Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear it. Before we get into it though, do remember to hit the like button if you enjoy this video or find it helpful. Subscribe as well if you're new and hit notifications to be updated on when I put out 2 videos every single week. But anyway, without further ado, let's get into the video. I'll drop a link in the description to the UK government article that goes over this in more detail and lays out its two-step plan for the future. But to briefly summarise, step 1 of the initiative moves what was originally Judgment Day for petrol and diesel cars from 2040 forwards to 2030, meaning manufacturers can no longer sell new exclusively fossil-fueled cars from then on. Step 2 makes it so that all new cars and vans will be fully zero emissions from the rear end by 2035. On top of this, the government has pledged £1.8 billion to try and incentivize people into buying zero emissions cars, which means building more charge points for both the public and for homes with electric cars, investing in more innovation for clean technology, and trying to get more zero emissions cars built here in the UK. Part of the grant is also to help people to buy zero emission or ultra low emission vehicles, ultimately in an attempt to drive prices down. In December 2020, there will also be the introduction of green number plates for particularly low or zero emission vehicles, which will likely give them additional perks. They're also committing £500 million to try and put the UK at the forefront of design and manufacturing of zero emission cars, which means they're hoping to ultimately increase the number of jobs in the automotive sector by 40,000 while supporting those that already exist. Outside of cars, which I won't discuss in this video, there's also incentivization taking place for boats, planes and e-hire bike schemes to get all of these areas as clean on emissions as possible. Now, before we even begin talking about this, let me quickly flex my first class politics and international relations degree at you by saying that I reckon this is a little bit of posturing by the UK government on a global scale. Reducing emissions in the UK alone will not solve the global climate crisis or climate issue that we have, because the UK is not the globe. It's pretty simple. If you read the article or the press release, there's a lot in there around how we are the first Western or developed economy to be pushing to this kind of level and moving this quickly into the climate change debate. It's basically an attempt to say, look at how good we're doing and hoping that other countries follow suit as well. And ultimately we get to be leaders in the discussion on this topic. I mean, I would mention that our track and trace app was supposed to be a leading thing as well, but how'd that turn out? But pessimism aside, this article even discusses how they want to start what is called a Zero Emission Vehicle Transition Council hosted by our own business secretary. The idea of it being to accelerate a global transition towards zero emission vehicles. If I'm taking a pessimistic political science view of the whole situation, it's basically a way for the UK to look like it's doing a really great job in front of everyone else and get everyone else interested in the situation. If I'm looking at it from an optimistic perspective though, or an optimistic political science perspective, then I might be saying, oh no, this is something we really care about and we're trying to shame other countries into also doing the same by getting ahead of the game. It's probably a bit of both, if I'm perfectly honest, because the people who will be putting this stuff together in the civil service are probably quite interested in the environment, and the people who are in government are probably quite interested in looking good in front of the global forum, I suppose. I think it's a particularly interesting time this has come out as well, because obviously the Democrats just won the US election and it was unlikely that Trump was going to take them down any route into the environment, considering they're taking them out of most environmental stuff over the last 4 years or whatever. So the fact that we have Democrats in power instead, that would suggest it's probably a good time to start looking at the climate change issue in slightly more depth. I could go more in depth on this topic, but I won't, because this is cars with JB, not politics with JB, but I'll just leave it on this. This whole debate around climate change, whilst it's important and I really do back it and I really think that we need to look at the environment, it's kind of pointless unless we can get China on side as well, because they currently produce more CO2 than the next 3 biggest pollutants combined, America, India and Russia. They literally more than double America. It's crazy. So if you can't get China on board with this kind of stuff, then you're going to get a lot of other countries thinking, well, I mean, China's cracking on, so can't we crack on too? And then China can also argue, well, you guys all had very polluting industrial revolutions, now it's our turn, why is it a problem when we do it? So there's all sorts of debates around this, and it's really interesting from a politics side, but we'll save that for another day, or a blog. I'll write a blog angrily about it or something, who knows. Anyway, back to the important point here. You will still be able to buy second-hand petrol and diesel cars after the year 2030. You will also be able to buy brand new combustion engined cars as long as they are hybrids and they are deemed to be able to travel a significant distance on zero emissions. Now, significant emissions are going to be defined after some consultation apparently, but I mean, that could be literally 20 meters or 200 miles. Like literally there's no indication of how long that significant distance has to be at the moment. And then after 2035, assuming that there are no further changes between now and then, you will only be able to buy cars with zero emissions. Currently, it will still be fine to buy secondhand petrol and diesel and hybrid cars at that point though. So first of all, how will this affect the prices of combustion engine cars? Now, probably negatively. And that's not just because of Wednesday's press release, but if you think about the ultra low emission zone in London, the T charge as well, and the congestion charge, all of these things are levied pretty heavily at diesel cars and petrol cars that are older than 2004. The residual values of diesel cars have not plummeted, I wouldn't say, but they have definitely decreased since this has been in place in the UK. There's a whole bunch of articles saying that it's fallen to different levels, but ultimately the key point remains: diesel cars are now less valuable because of these kinds of initiatives. More initiatives like this will begin to affect newer petrol and diesel cars as well, and as they start to affect those cars, their values will probably also drop because they'll become more expensive to own and live with, and therefore less desirable by anyone. And as these cars start to get affected, what you'll probably find is that more electric cars will be hitting the market over the next 10 years. It sounds pretty simple, but it's just what we can expect, and probably other zero emission style cars too. Hopefully this will decrease the used value of these cars, and hopefully the batteries and stuff are all good on used cars as well, and they can actually last a longer period of time, and that will make them more attractive for people to buy. If these electric cars continue to develop well and other innovations in this space begin to give us other ways of powering our cars that are more practical or similar to the practicality that we get from combustion engined cars, then if you're looking to get a daily driver and you have the cash, unless you really love combustion engines, there would basically be less of a rationale behind buying one for practical purposes. So put simply, there will be more cheaper and also used cheap zero emission vehicles available on the market, and lots of incentives to buy and drive them, while there will be fewer combustion engined cars which will become more expensive to use as daily drivers, so fewer people will want them, which means fewer will probably sell second hand, which also therefore means you might even find that there's a bit of a surplus of cheap to buy used fossil cars on Auto Trader, Gumtree and eBay all of a sudden. It could also mean that manufacturers might struggle if they keep producing and selling petrol and diesel cars in the UK up until the year 2030, because some people might be trying to sort of extend the life out of their petrol and diesel cars before moving on to an electric one. So people who might have bought a new car every 3 years might carry that on until 5 or 6 years or something, just so that they can make a good transition over to an electric vehicle instead. Irrespective, from my humble position as a random YouTuber sitting in his bedroom making videos, the government and civil service really needs to make sure that they keep in mind the interests of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. I appreciate that the environment is probably the single most pressing issue for the continuation of the human race over the coming years, etc. But I am slightly worried that the best technology that we have for zero emissions vehicles won't really be available at cheap prices by 2030, and that will mean that you're basically pricing out people that don't earn very much money or don't have very much money from being able to move into those cars, even if they're sort of second-hand cars and stuff. I'd be surprised if you get second-hand cars in 10 years that are electric vehicles that are actually really useful for these people to own and drive, which means they'll probably have to continue to drive the cars that they already own, which are probably petrol or diesel, which will likely have sanctions on them, and if that's the case, you're basically punishing people for being poor. It's a catch-22. You're too poor to afford a car that would stop you getting sanctions, so you get sanctioned because you still have to drive your car. What I'm basically trying to say is that people shouldn't be priced out of being environmentally conscious and then punished for being priced out of it. So unless there are any further changes to legislation on top of what we've already seen, I would say the answer to the question, how long will people be able to drive petrol or diesel cars for, will be as long as they can afford to, because probably the case will be that they can still drive these cars. It will just be more expensive to drive them. You'll probably find more tax on fuel. This is all speculation, but ultimately it'll probably just get more and more expensive to own those cars and less expensive and more enticing to own cars that are zero emissions. And of course, as a result of that, combustion engine cars will probably lose their value. On a completely separate note though, some fossil fuel cars may well maintain their current values, if not increase them, particularly those in the classic or exotic market. From the year 2030, you will no longer be able to buy a brand new V12 Ferrari with a screaming engine that's naturally aspirated, unless it also has a hybrid motor attached, which enables the car to drive that significant distance we were talking about. That means that many desirable or enthusiast cars might go up in value just simply because we know that we'll never be able to see a new one of them again, and there is at that point a finite amount of them. Basically, their modern classic statuses will be brought forward pretty significantly. However, this is massively dependent on so many factors. It could be that the government imposes huge taxes on buying or owning fossil fuel vehicles, so having these cars could become more of a burden than it's worth for many people, which would be a detriment to these values and hit those that like to collect cars as investments. Or it could be that the government imposes huge taxes on fossil fuels themselves, so actually filling a tank costs a small fortune. If we look at history, it isn't actually impossible that regardless of all of these potential changes, these cars maintain their value anyway. Look at historic cars in the UK. If your car is over 40 years old, then you no longer have to pay road tax on it, and you also don't have to pay the T-charge or the ULEZ in London. So though it might not be helpful immediately for the most recent of supercars, etc., these might actually become quite reasonable to own in the future when they're considered to be classics. You never know, maybe in the year 2070 or whatever, you'll see a whole bunch of 2000s, 2010s and 2020s exotic cars just cruising around because they've suddenly become tax exempt. But obviously a lot will probably change between now and then, so it's very hard to predict. So it's going back to that question around how will this affect combustion car prices. For daily driver cars, they will probably decrease in value. For exotic cars, it's slightly more difficult to predict, potentially more factors influencing it, but ultimately their prices, I reckon, will probably stay pretty similar or go up in value because there will be a finite amount of them. It all just depends on how badly the government wants to harass people's bank balances, basically. If I'm being hopeful, at least in the midterm, a switch to zero emissions cars should make owning a car cheaper for the vast majority of average people with average incomes. If the incentives have to last until there's a hefty uptake of zero emissions vehicles, then people who are early adopters will be able to benefit from those incentives for longer and ultimately end up being the key winners here. The pessimist in me looks to the long term though, and with the general war on cars in cities, particularly in London, I really don't think that even if everyone drove zero emissions vehicles, there wouldn't end up being a high cost for owning a car anyway. Zero emissions will become the norm, but the government will still want to make money out of us, as will the energy companies and providers, so ultimately the cost of owning a car will just end up being the same because like they have no reason to charge us more, but they have no reason when everyone's on them to charge us any less. I do sort of empathize with that because even if I don't like it, ultimately we shouldn't have to be incentivized to care about the planet. Probably we should just care about it in the first place, but that doesn't mean that I don't want a screaming V10, because I do want a screaming V10, and it's very hard to kind of work the two at the same time or balance the two. Yes, I care about the environment, but oh my gosh, do I want a Carrera GT? So yes, basically in the midterm, if you can get on and use and take advantage of all of these incentives, your bank account might look slightly better, but in the longer term, the cost of owning a car will basically remain the same. I just wanted to talk about the additional 40,000 jobs that the government says it's going to create in the sector, because we're suddenly going to be making a load more parts, etc. for all of these different electric vehicles or zero emissions vehicles. will it also take jobs away from mechanics? My dad is an independent car mechanic coming towards the end of his career now, so it probably won't affect him in the same way, but he's worked on a few Teslas and that kind of stuff, and yes, he can still work on the structural stuff like wishbones and all of the basic stuff around it, but can't really work on the electric motor in the same way. And the vast majority of his work is made up of cars going wrong on the engine department as opposed to other parts. Yes, those parts are also important, but bread and butter is generally the engine. And yes, I know that these cars aren't just going to disappear, but over that transitional period, there will be fewer new petrol cars, which means there'll be fewer old petrol cars, if you get what I'm saying, relative to other periods of time. So there will be fewer people coming to him as a customer with engine problems in their cars. The people who I feel the worst for are people who are trained to become mechanics right now, because you've basically got like a window of like maybe 20 years, I reckon, 20 years to be able to work on these types of cars, at least whilst making a decent amount of money. And it will become probably more difficult year on year after 2030. As a final thought, the key thing for all of us in this situation is that manufacturers continue to innovate with zero emissions vehicles. I haven't and won't touch on the social and environmental impact of developing batteries and the minerals that are needed in the process of creating them, but these are also very important factors in making sure that we remain sustainable with electric cars if we go down that route. But let's not also forget about potential nuclear cars or hydrogen cars and biofuel cars and all that good stuff. If cars of the future don't serve us as well as cars of today do, as in terms of practicality and usability and all that kind of stuff, then I'm slightly worried that people will look back on this era as if it was the golden era of cars, rather than looking at all of the potential new technologies and amazing advancements that will take place in cars over the coming years. So basically my request to car manufacturers is keep innovating and make sure that cars are as sick in the future as they are today. Now I'm sure there are a whole bunch of hurdles in the way, but where is the Tesla for nuclear powered cars, and where is the Elon Musk obsessive over hydrogen cars? I'm sure they're out there. They need to start growing ASAP so that by 2030 we've got all these different options of cars to drive. Or a company needs to come in quick in the whole conversion of fossil fuel cars into hydrogen cars and all that good stuff. Anyway, a few times I seem to have gone off tangent a little bit in this video, but hopefully it's given you something to work with and some things to think about. Anything that you want to add into the conversation, put it in the comments down below. I'd be super interested to hear what you guys think of this new legislation and what you think you're gonna do. Are you gonna switch to a zero emission car earlier or later? Do you love petrol cars and diesel cars too much? Let me know all down below. Please do hit the like button if you enjoyed the video or if you found it useful. I would really appreciate it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Massive thank you to the patrons as always for their support, and to you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one.